Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we've got our third installment of our 200th episode. So in the last, 200 episodes, we've talked a lot about Pilates. And this is partly because it's really popular. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Pilates, whether it's Pilates Reformer, Mat Pilates, Megaformer, Legree. I know Legree and Megaformer aren't technically Pilates, but sometimes people associate that with Pilates. And we've done a lot of different episodes. So I wanted to do one episode talking about the main questions that we get around this topic. And so I brought Payton with me today to talk about this because, number one, you have taught Reformer Pilates. And so you have a background of it. And then number two, I think that we could just have a discussion about a lot of this stuff. So you guys aren't just hearing me talk solo Mike all the time and getting sick of me. So welcome, Payton.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Hey. So let's start with, first of all, there's a lot of different types of Pilates. And anytime we talk about Pilates, we get comments from classical Pilates people saying that's not Pilates, or other types of methods that say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to this. Let's just say, okay, in this conversation, for the most part, we're talking about any method, whether it's Pilates or barre or any type of fitness that's kind of higher rep and lower weight. And I know classical Pilates isn't always high rep.
Exactly.
So
not at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not. It's lower rep. But it's still, from my understanding, it's still lighter weight.
Yeah. So with classical Pilates, and I think that's where it's interesting. There's almost multiple different arguments within the comment sections for these different posts or different ideas around Pilates because of all these different camps within Pilates. So when Pilates was initially created as a form of rehabilitation, it was back in war times, and Joseph Pilates literally rigging up these machines that would eventually become the apparatus that we see today, to help with resistance and to help with people who were recovering from injury. And so the purpose of classical Pilates is not necessarily strength training, is not necessarily muscle hypertrophy. It is very much so controlled repetitions. There's no mention of, or at least in my classical training and then in the classical work that I've done in the past, there's no mention of getting close to failure because the purpose isn't to hypertrophy the muscles. It's to create more neuromuscular awareness. It's to help with posture. It's to help with core stability, things like that. And so it's not what has kind of morphed into quote unquote Pilates or barre of the really high rep, really low load, getting that muscle burn type of sensation. So those are definitely two different camps.
Yeah, and I think over time people have associated Pilates with, and I think this is the marketing of it, and maybe not Pilates, but like people who have taken Pilates and created different methods out of classical Pilates. It's been like tone your body or create lengthen or create like a longer, leaner physique. And so the marketing behind Pilates is, I think, what we like to educate about.
Yes.
And so that's what I want to talk to today. It's not like, is there a place, is classical Pilates wrong?
Right.
Absolutely not. And there might be a place for classical Pilates or any type of movement and any type of or form or method of Pilates or higher rep training. Maybe there's a place for it. We could talk about that in a little bit. But this is let's just talk about like the science of like, what is this doing for you?
Yes.
So starting with classical Pilates aside, just starting with any kind of high rep, low load method, is that building muscle?
So oftentimes, no. Again, depending on the method. But with research, we know that the rep range is large, but there is a higher end. There is a ceiling to that. So the rep range within research is 6 to 30-ish reps each set, and taking that set close to failure. That's the key. And oftentimes in these lower load, higher reps, you're getting well beyond 30 repetitions, and often not even getting close to failure even beyond the 30 reps. You're often stopped by that burning sensation, that buildup of metabolites in the muscle, which we used to think, or it almost is like common sense. It seems like that would be causing muscle growth. But we now know from very good research that that is not a key indicator at all. It's one of the elements, but it is not a significant contributor to muscle growth or muscle hypertrophy. So oftentimes that is more of the limiting factor with this higher rep, lower load training, not truly getting close to muscle failure.
Right. And so people are like, oh, well, I'm not trying to build muscle. I'm trying to tone up.
Yeah. And then that's where it really is semantics. So tone, it has become this thing in the fitness world, in the fitness industry. And when people say tone, and when they think about a quote unquote toned aesthetic, they're most likely thinking of someone who's on the leaner side, where they have visible muscle definition and a lower body fat percentage. And in order to attain that aesthetic, there has to be a level of muscle growth, or there has to be a level of decreasing your fat percentage enough to make your already there muscle more visible. And so with high rep, low load training, that's not going to contribute much in either direction. It's not going to contribute much to the fat loss piece. We know that that primarily comes from nutrition. And then it's not going to contribute much to the muscle growth piece. We know that in order to elicit muscle growth, we've got to get close to that muscle failure point in each of those sets and train the muscles a little bit more specifically. So we often hear the argument of like, well, my Pilates instructor looks like X, Y, and Z, or my blah, blah. A lot of people that gravitate towards Pilates and gravitate towards this higher rep, lower load training or teaching come from a dance background. They come from a background where they've already kind of genetically had that aesthetic. And just us as females in general, we tend to perform better with these endurance type activities. We've got a lot of those type 1 muscle fibers and we do well with that type of training. So it's more likely that they've gravitated towards it with more of this aesthetic already, give or take, and then have gone about their way. Not that the high rep, low load training itself has caused that aesthetic.
Yeah. And I think I've talked about this before. There are exceptions,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Where
super responders.
Right. There's super responders, if we look at the literature, who can basically do everything against what the average person can do.
Yes.
And they can still see muscle growth.
Yes.
So what happens, I think, is those are a lot of the people that we are seeing visibly, like on the internet or that are leading methods or creating certain methods because they have responded really well to that specific method. But when the average population or the average person applies those principles, they may not see the same benefits because that person that's the leader of that might be an outlier, an exception rather than the rule.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Yeah. So I think that that's important to acknowledge is that, yeah, some people absolutely can not apply what we see in science and still see results and still see benefits. I can think of a friend in particular who basically can just like look at a weight and she's jacked and she's just like naturally like that.
Yes.
And so she doesn't really have to lift close to failure and she's in her 50s, which is incredible. And so I'm not like that. I cannot do lighter weight, super high rep training because I won't see any
Visible
change.
muscle growth,
right. Any change. So I think people's next question is, okay, well, what is this doing then? Why do it?
So there's a lot of value in movement in general.
Yeah.
If you're not going to do anything or you're going to do this, obviously do this. There is so much value in moving our bodies. There's so much value in doing things that you enjoy as well. Especially if you're coming from doing nothing, you will likely see some results as a newbie, seeing those newbie gains, even just going into the more of the body weight or lighter load. So there's a lot of value in if you have a barrier to entry in general and exercise feels really daunting or overwhelming, that could be a really good entry point for you. And there's a lot of value in that. So I think that's one of the ways.
Yeah, I think so too. I think also the beginner conversation is interesting because Pilates can be really good for your body awareness. So if you're newer to exercise, or if you feel like you struggle with body awareness in like lifting, it can be a way for you to develop neuromuscular connection, develop better proprioception, understanding where your body is in space. Because a lot of Pilates classes, the cueing is really detailed. You're holding positions. So when you're holding a position, oftentimes you have the time and opportunity to kind of think about what muscles are contracting, how am I positioning my joints, because it's slow.
Yes.
And you're holding these certain positions. So if you are new, you feel like you're struggling with body awareness, or maybe you're someone who like you try Evlo and you film yourself, which sometimes we'll recommend, like to check your form, film yourself, and you're like, oh my gosh, I am not moving the way I feel like I'm moving. Maybe it's something you're like, okay, maybe I go to a Pilates class or two and like really think about, okay, can I improve my body awareness, my neuromuscular connection, and then go into lifting once you feel like you have a better handle on that. Because if we look at like dancers and ballerinas and people who are applying some of these principles that we see carry into like barre specifically, or even Pilates, they have incredible body awareness.
Absolutely.
They can do exactly what they want with their body, and it's because they've developed this neuromuscular connection.
Yeah. And there's a ton of value in that then in going into strength training, because when we have more awareness of where our joints are in space, when we have more of that connection, we can then get better motor outputs to the muscles themselves and recruit the muscles better and make our work even more productive.
Yeah. I do think, though, too, I want to do a podcast about this because I'm actually, interestingly, researching this a little bit more, this mind-muscle connection. And studies do show that you tend to see, it's interesting, you tend to see better results when you have that mind-muscle connection, but primarily for the upper body. The lower body doesn't really show much difference, which I just think is so interesting. And what the literature also shows is even if you don't have that mind-muscle connection, as long as you're mechanically loading the muscle, you're still going to see results. It might be a little less than if you really felt connected and you could feel the muscle contracting and things like that. But I think that people might over-index on the mind-muscle connection thing. And although important, I think that it's just like, okay, get moving and get loading your body.
Yes. No, we hear that sometimes too, especially with things like the glutes, of having trouble sensing the glutes. And it truly, like you're saying, if you're applying the correct mechanical load and you're noticing that decrease in velocity in your lifts and things, that's going to be enough to elicit muscle growth. You don't have to be able to sense it.
Right.
And I think that'll be a really interesting podcast.
Yeah. And I think that's why people love Pilates, because they can really feel the muscles burning, shaking, which I want to talk about here in a moment, working, and it feels really hard. It feels really challenging. It might feel really targeted, really satisfying. And studies show that feeling something, so that would show up as like EMG if you were studying the activation of the muscle, doesn't necessarily equate, or it's an unreliable predictor of hypertrophy.
Right.
So just because you're feeling something doesn't necessarily mean that it's targeting it more effectively. A great example of this in practice is a study looked at the difference in hip thrusts versus squats for glute development. And it found that both hip thrusts and squats, given the correct intensity, so given that you're taking them both to close to muscular failure, grew the glutes equally. But people feel their glutes a lot more in a hip thrust than they do in a squat. So people might feel or sense that a hip thrust is more effective because they feel it, when really we see equivalent muscle growth. So I think people think that Pilates and barre is more effective because they feel it so much, but that's not necessarily maybe what's happening. So.
Right.
It's all about the mechanical load. If you go back to it, it's all about getting close to failure in under 30 reps.
Yep.
So that takes us to the burn, the shake, just the overall challenge.
Yes.
So I think that gets confused as it's burning, I'm shaking, I'm trembling, and it feels hard, so that must mean it's more effective.
Right. And I feel like this is a really big thing on social media. It has been for years now, but I feel like even more and more now we're seeing it, and we're seeing I feel like there's been a trend of seeing men who are like, I'm this big, strong guy, I do all this strength training, and this Pilates class, this reformer class just annihilated me. And so I think it's a really important conversation. And I loved your post that you did recently on this, and speaking to the shaking element specifically, I think would be helpful if you could go into how you talked about it there.
Yeah. So shaking essentially happens for different reasons, and these are all theories. We don't know for sure, but essentially shaking happens generally from neuromuscular fatigue or unfamiliarity with a position. So it generally happens when you've been holding something for a long period of time. Certain muscles are firing as other muscles are fatiguing, and so you get this like shaking or trembling feeling. And people think that, oh, I'm shaking, I'm trembling, that's because I'm challenging my muscles sufficiently to grow.
Right.
But oftentimes this is from neuromuscular fatigue from endurance, not because you're loading the muscle close to failure. So oftentimes the shaking isn't necessarily the stimulus that causes muscle fatigue. It's a side effect. Or I'm sorry, it's not a stimulus that causes hypertrophy. It's a side effect of fatigue.
Yes.
Same with the burn.
Yes.
The burn is also just a side effect of fatigue, generally from higher rep, more endurance type training. It's not necessarily the stimulus that will cause muscle growth, because the stimulus, again, we go back to it, is mechanical stress, approaching muscular failure in under 30 reps. You can have shaking that accompanies getting close to failure in under 30 reps. Sometimes towards the end of my sets, I'll shake, but it's because of fatigue, right? So that can accompany a stimulus that causes hypertrophy or muscle growth, but it isn't the cause of it, and I think that's really important to distinguish.
I think it is too, because it goes back to the thing of, if something makes sense, it's easier to kind of disseminate online or easier to accept as fact or truth. When something feels really hard, when something feels really difficult, it's like, well, then why wouldn't it be giving me results? But if the results that you're looking for are muscle growth, that's where we can kind of separate those out.
Yeah, right. And I think I just always go back to people who are like, well, I just want the longer, leaner physique. So I think we could talk about that. We talked about how it's not necessarily contributing to like leanness or body fat percentage, because that's mostly nutrition related, is leanness. Longer looking.
Yeah.
Where does this come from?
I think it has to come from who gravitates towards becoming a Pilates and barre instructor. That's the main thing that I can think of, because we know that you cannot change the insertion points of your muscles. You cannot make your muscle longer. It is anchored down to bone, and you're not going to change that relationship. And so I think it has to come from, again, the body types that are gravitating more towards like making this a profession. They're coming from dance. They're coming from these different activities that make them really good candidates for this type of work. And so then again, you're looking at those figureheads. It's like, oh, well, that's the body type I want. So I should do whatever method or whatever exercise they're doing because I'm going to get that body type. But I found it really interesting. This was years ago when we were doing the Evlo teacher training, and one of the books was talking about, it's not whatever exercise. It's not the exercise or the sport that's causing these specific body types, but the body types that end up at these elite levels end up there because those are the body types that are the best at those activities. So
they have
swimmers
the genetic
yes.
predisposition.
Yes.
Yeah.
So swimmers is like I feel like one of the easiest things, and kind of takes it out of this heightened Pilates, dancer world. But it's not the swimming necessarily that's causing the body type of you just think of Michael Phelps as the broader shoulders and then coming in with a narrower waist, yada yada, the long limbs. It's not that swimming caused him to have those things. Like, yes, it causes you to build muscle in certain ways and things like that, but he excelled at it because of his genetic predispositions, leading him to be able to excel at an elite level.
Swimming isn't obviously changing like the length of his bones,
No,
the length of his muscles, like all of those are staying constant. And so I think the argument is, well, it's not like people are like, oh, well, I know it's not changing the origin and insertion of the muscle and things like that, but it's creating a longer, leaner looking physique. And maybe that's just from like fat loss in general. I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer.
It could just be from, I can't remember if we talked about wanting to talk about this later, but I think we're seeing it a lot too with people being like, I switched from strength training and now I just do Pilates and walking and I'm the smallest I've ever been. Well, it could just be literally from a loss of muscle mass, which we don't recommend. And that's almost the hard truth, is that we want people to be, especially women, to be building muscle, starting as early as they can and continuing on, because muscle is one of the most protective things that we can build for ourselves. It is the organ of longevity. It is what is going to take us into our later years feeling really good, functioning really well. And so while there might be a certain aesthetic that someone is aiming for or hoping for, if that comes at the cost in losing muscle, to me, that isn't worth the cost.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think because, again, if we look at, is this method applying the principles of hypertrophy? And if it's not, if the answer is no, if you're not approaching failure in, under 30-ish reps, if the answer is no, unfortunately, what we see from the studies is that it might not even be enough to maintain muscle.
Right.
Is doing high rep training, because in order to maintain these larger muscle fibers, they do need to be challenged frequently close to failure. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, these higher rep methods you might not even be maintaining muscle mass. So you might, like you said, might be losing muscle. Mm-hmm. I think another interesting, because I've thought about this a lot, because there's enough anecdotes out there that, like, okay, there's something to this, right? Like, people are saying, lots of people, especially on TikTok, are saying, like, I lifted and I did HIIT and now I'm walking and doing Pilates, like you said, and I feel like tighter and more toned than I ever have. And so I've thought about this a lot. Like, why is this happening to these people? I think it's the loss of muscle. Mm-hmm. I think also it might be they just might be less stressed overall.
1,000%.
And that might be causing certain behaviors that are improving their inflammation or allowing them to eat more balanced, allowing them to sleep and recover better, so they might be feeling physically less puffy and inflamed. Mm-hmm. They might actually see some weight loss because their behaviors are changing around food. Maybe their cravings are less.
Yes.
Because they're less stressed overall. So it might not be the walking and the Pilates that's doing it. It might just be transitioning to a more appropriate, less stressful routine that's also allowing for enough recovery.
I think that's a huge element of it. And I also think that is why people see really great success with Evlo. Yeah. Not to toot our own horn, but that, I think, is an element of it. Is we often get people who are coming from higher intensity work, and they come into our method where we're starting with breath work and a warm up. We're being really intentional with the weightlifting that we are doing. And then we're ending with more mobility, more breath work, so that it feels really more balanced. You're not stepping off of your mat like you just got run over by a truck. And so you're not then going into the rest of your day in this heightened state. And that's not to say that we can't tolerate stress or that we shouldn't stress our bodies. That's not it at all. During the working portions of class, we are working hard. The lifts are difficult in the sense of we're challenging the muscles. You're going to feel that. But you're not going to feel this intense systemic work day after day, class after class, and then going into your otherwise stressful and busy life that would then lead you into making different choices and having different satiety and having different effects on your hormones that would affect how your hunger levels are and things like that. So I think that's why people see a lot of success with Evlo too, just like maybe they're seeing with Pilates.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's important to distinguish it and recognize that for a lot of people that is like what's happening that it's just a lifestyle change. And that's why the less is more thing. And that's what I do love about this kind of shift in the fitness industry is that it is bringing awareness to, maybe there is something to this less is more thing. Maybe it is really better for us. I'm seeing physical change in my body from doing less and doing less intense exercise. So maybe there is something to it. So I think we've unfortunately gone on the other side of things where we don't stress our bodies and our muscular system enough.
Yes.
And so then you're seeing eventually negative changes where you're losing a significant amount of muscle mass. We're losing it with age anyways. And so we really do need to maintain, if not build it, by training close to failure. So I think that there's a balance and of let's stress our muscles appropriately, but not so much. We don't need to, do hit an hour-long crazy boot camp classes every single day to see the results that we're looking for. So
Yep. I think that's so important.
let's switch gears and talk about a question that we get a lot. And I'm just going to go ahead and address this like head on, because we literally probably get this in a DM like every single day.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Legree Megaformer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So then we come to the other arguments in the comment section, in the DMs. So with Megaformer work and Legree, we looked into this for one of our coffee chats a while back, and I thought it was really interesting. So I'm glad we're bringing it here again. On Legree's website specifically, they mention that they're going for more of that endurance work. Like that is specifically what they're targeting. And when thinking of endurance work, we're thinking of taking lifts longer than 30 reps, and we're thinking of tapping more into the type 1 muscle fibers, which are the smaller muscle fibers, which we do well at maintaining anyway, typically as we age. So with Legree and then with other Megaformer methods, it is oftentimes higher resistance. Like the springs themselves are physically heavier than a more traditional reformer class, either classical or just Pilates reformer class in general. And so it feels hard as all get out. Like it is very intense. And so especially with those methods, when people do them, they're like, there's no way that this isn't building muscle. And that's the sort of thing, like we say with everything, if they're applying the principles, then it can. Like if you are truly getting close to muscle failure in under 30 reps or less, then absolutely those types of workouts could elicit muscle growth. Oftentimes with Legree and Megaformer classes, they're very global. So you're working a lot of things at once. And so that's where our conversation around combination moves and things comes into play as well. It's interesting because if you're, going out into a plank against heavy resistance and then also trying to work the lift and work the glute at the same time, you're probably not getting a whole lot of load to the glute while you're trying to stabilize against heavy resistance. You might get close to failure elsewhere or in the shoulders or whatever it is from an isometric standpoint or just a holding, but you're likely not going to get there in the glutes. So there's a lot of global work. It's not as specific, so it might not be as time effective for muscle hypertrophy than just piecing things out and being just a little more simple, honestly.
Yeah. I went to a class once and we did a great exercise where we were on the back of the carriage and we had the cables in either hands and we were basically doing like step ups.
Oh, nice.
And with resistance. And I was like, this is an example of an exercise that could build muscle in the glutes if you're using enough resistance. But the way we were doing it, if I'm remembering correctly, this was years ago, but we were kind of pulsing in it and we were there for minutes.
Yeah.
So I think if I could go back, I would be like, okay, let me just do reps, just down and up, and see how many I could do. And if I can do far beyond 30, then the resistance just isn't enough to build muscle.
Right.
But if not, then, and I'm taking that close to failure, then yeah, it absolutely can build muscle. So I think it's a nuanced conversation. It's not, does it build muscle or does it not? It depends on the exercise selection. It depends on how closely you're getting to failure. And I think people confuse, especially in something like this, confuse fatigue and failure.
Yes. And I actually just saw something come up on my Instagram a few days ago from they said they were a Legree specific instructor, and they said I saw this on their website as well, that their whole method is about time under tension and increasing that. And so to your point of the minutes thing, oftentimes if you are holding things for 2 minutes at a time, you're well beyond that threshold of when you would needed to have gotten to close to failure in order to see muscle growth.
Right.
So you're getting a ton of fatigue, a ton of systemic fatigue, and getting some muscle fatigue. But it's just this generalized fatigue that's not going to be specific enough oftentimes.
And oftentimes it creates a lot of soreness.
Yes.
And people think that, oh, I'm really sore, so that must mean that I worked my muscles effectively.
And we will get questions too, especially as new people come in. That's often a question that we get, and we have a little guide on it because it is such an FAQ. But soreness is not an indicator of muscle growth. It's not a reliable indicator at all. It often happens when, one, you're newer to a program. It's very common. And then two, it often happens with eccentric movements. So where the muscle is lengthening, not meaning the insertion points are moving, but the muscle is lengthening as a load is applied to it. So in Evlo world, thinking of something like a matrix or a reverse Nordic curl, oftentimes will lead to more soreness than something like a bicep curl. And someone mentioned that the other day, like, I'm never sore in my biceps. It's like, well, we do a lot of concentric work with biceps. Of course, you're getting eccentric when you're lowering the weights down, but especially once you're in with a program, you're used to the movement patterns, you're not going to find a whole lot of soreness, but that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, because then your soreness isn't limiting you from showing up the next day to your workout.
Right. It's not limiting your recovery. You actually it's probably ideal to have light to no muscle soreness after each workout.
Yes.
Because it doesn't mean you're not building muscle or seeing results. But I think that's a lot of times why people, like, a common question or a common comment that I see when I talk about Pilates on the internet is, you must have not been into a Pilates class because it wrecks me.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, there's a big difference between being hard and being effective. And I think that's something that, again, we just sound like broken records. But yeah, I do think that we need to distinguish between that, because if we think about it, if you're doing a workout that's wrecking you, like physically leaving you really sore, that's going to inhibit your recovery. And so the next time you go to work out, you are less likely to be able to contract your muscles to a high degree and get really high quality stimulus and work to the muscle that you're targeting.
Yep.
So it can interfere with your recovery and therefore interfere with your results. So I think it's kind of like, is being really hard and wrecking your body actually not great for you?
Right.
I mean, maybe, especially if you're doing that like frequently.
Yeah, and we talk about this often. We know, as fitness instructors, we know what we could do to make someone think that one of our classes is the hardest thing they've ever done.
Yeah.
It's honestly not hard to do.
No.
And not hard to program for.
Here's exactly what I would do. I would do a bunch of burpees and make people get their heart rate up. I would hold things for a really, really long time and do lots of like pulses and drop sets. I would do a lot of eccentric work, so lowering phase, so they would be really sore. It's like, but none of that really makes a big enough difference, but you are going to feel really wrecked and sore and tired.
Right. And so it's like, we could easily do that, but our whole goal, I think, with this conversation too, is to help people to make the most with their time, to use their time really productively, because we're all really busy.
Yeah.
And to be able to allow you to think about your programming or to think about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis that allows you to show up on that day-to-day basis, that doesn't leave you with these periods of consistency and then falling out because of soreness or time restrictions or whatever it is. And so I think that's always our hope with these types of conversation, is just to educate and to give you all the information. And if you still want to go and do that class, go and do that class.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of like reframing and really understanding the science behind things and the purpose behind things that I think can be really helpful for people making educated decisions about their own fitness.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, because I think, some people are like, well, I just like it and it's fun. And I'm like, there's value to that. Do it.
Value. Yep.
Do it. And especially if that's what's going to like allow you to stay consistent, like keep going. And I think another question along these lines that we get is, I like going for the community aspect. It's fun. I love the energy, which I totally understand. Because that's why I love group fitness, is because of like the community, the energy, the music, all of that. So I get it. I love it. And so people are like, well, can I do Evlo or another strength training program and then do this as like a recovery day or supplementary to what I'm already doing?
Yeah. That one's such a hard one, because it so depends on the method. It so depends on what they're doing within the classes. I know what we typically recommend if someone wants to do that within the Evlo framework is to do our classes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from the 4-time-a-week track, have a rest day or a recovery day, active recovery day on Thursday, and then do a reformer class either Friday or Saturday, so that we know for sure you're not butting up against the muscle groups we've worked in Evlo either in the days before or the days after. Yeah. So giving yourself that buffer. I think in general, we wouldn't really recommend them on any recovery day, because especially if you're doing Evlo, because on those active recovery days, the whole goal is we want you to stay active, we want you to move, but we want you to allow your muscles to recover. So even though you're not necessarily stimulating your muscles in the same way in these types of classes, you still are going to have demand to the muscle. So we typically like to recommend on recovery days doing your cardio. So, and that can be your lighter intensity cardio. That could be like a really short bout of your higher intensity cardio, but something that's not going to be as stressful to your system overall.
Yeah, exactly. I think a good rule of thumb is like, if you're doing this class and it makes you really sore or it inhibits your recovery, then it's probably not appropriate for a recovery day.
Yeah, that's a much simpler, better way to think of it. Yep.
Yes, but you nailed it.
I think that kind of encapsulates all of our thoughts. And again, like just to highlight what you mentioned at the beginning of my background, like there is definitely value in enjoying the group element and all of those things. And I saw a lot of value in that. And that is how I started in the fitness world while I was in college. And so we always want to make sure when we're having these conversations, we are never in the business of demonizing a specific movement type or a method, but we just really want to give you all the info that we have at our hands at this point, and then we'll continue to update that as that comes.
Exactly. It's just one of those things that like I wish I would have known.
Yeah.
Like I wish I would have understood earlier, because I might have made different decisions in my past if I had understood all the information. So
agreed.
Thank you for being here, Payton.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yay. We'll see you all next week. Same time, same place. Bye for now.